Welcome to Fragmented, a software developer podcast where we talk about building good software and becoming better developers. My name's Don Felker.
And I'm Kaushik Gopal.
Welcome to the show. Kaushik, so you wrote an interesting blog post recently.
Yeah, it was basically fire on fire on fire.
What was the initial, the impetus of what kicked your blog post off? I know it was a tweet of some sort, but what was the tweet about and kind of why did you decide to write it?
There's this really famous tech reporter / journalist who goes by the name Ben Thompson. And he wrote this post on his very famous tech blog called Stratechery. So it's more like a newsletter of sorts, okay. Like a daily update or something. He wrote he tweeted this thing because he recently jumped onto Android, and I think he's using an Android phone. It's the Sony Xperia 1 Mark II. I think that's what it's called.
Godspeed.
Yeah. But, he had good things to say about it for the most part. But then he also went on to saying the third-party apps on Android are basically garbage. Mm-hmm. And so where it really got controversial is in a subsequent tweet, he basically said, and the only folks to blame are the developers. They should really care. They don't care enough. The problem with this tweet was he said developers, and developers are lazy, and that obviously enraged a whole bunch of people, me included. Mm-hmm. He has since corrected. He also has another paid podcast that he does with this other iOS celebrity named John Gruber. Both of them are okay. Yeah. So it's called Dithering.fm. So in a subsequent episode, he has sort of corrected what he meant, and he did admit. He said it was a poor choice of wording. When he said developers, he basically meant developers as people who develop app, and that included company. So it wasn't people per se.
Yeah.
So in his mind, Facebook would be developers. Google would be developers, and in that context, it definitely seems far less offensive. But from the initial tweet, as is the case with most things on Twitter, since you only have 140 characters, sometimes you don't get the opportunity to explain yourself completely, right?
Yeah, context gets lost in Twitter all the time. People explode over that stuff a lot, which can be easily taken out of context.
Yeah, and it was the same case for me too, right? I was enraged too, and I was like, whoa, lazy developers. And so before the whole clarifying thing came, a lot of people replied in those tweets. A lot of Android developers extremely angry with his comment, replied. My initial gut reaction was also to reply in full rage and fury. But, as you probably know, over time, we've seen a lot of things like this in the past. And the smartest thing, and I think you might have also been the person who gave the 3 buckets analogy thing, right? Mm-hmm. So part of me was it always makes sense to take some time to think about what you want to say and then say it well, right? You don't want to regret what you say just because, you're angry. Nothing good comes off of that.
Yeah, I agree. It's,
yeah.
I think you said the 3 buckets, that is a blog post that I did write. We can put that in the show notes. But I also think it's important, and I think you did this, is to recognize when you have that visceral reaction to something that someone said, could be in person, could be a blog post, could be a tweet, whatever. But anytime you have that visceral reaction, that's an opportunity for you to look inside and say, all right, why am I feeling that way? Is it exposing something in myself that perhaps that I'm not comfortable with? And I know a lot of times that's the case for me. And I need to kind of look back and say, all right, well, I'm not saying that everyone's lazy, not at all, or lazy developers, but it's a chance for me to look back and say, all right, have I been lazy? Yeah. But in fact, I am going to tell you that I am a lazy developer because I want to make things as easy as possible. But again, that whole, what he was saying about the applications, everything is easily taken out of context. And I kind of want to get into your, I guess you would say, response blog post, which was very well written.
Thank you.
So if you can kind of walk us through what your response was, and then we can kind of dissect it from there.
For sure. So my whole point with the response was my gut reaction to what he said about developers, the characterization about developers was obviously completely wrong. He's got that piece wrong. But, like you said, there was like an element of truth. There was like some shred of truth to what he said about the quality of third-party apps. And I know maybe I'm not everyone subscribes to the same opinion, but I generally think that there are like a lot of really top-notch, amazing, high-quality apps on both platforms. But if I were to pick, well, let me actually step back a little. So like a common response to what he said about like the third-party apps, right, is people usually say, well, okay, let's compare two apps. Take the app on Twitter, or take the Gmail app on iOS and the Gmail app on Android, and let's compare and like, tell me if one is better than the other. And look, like these they aren't that different. They're the same. So like your whole position is wrong. Mm-hmm. Yes, that's one way to look at it, but it's like tricky because, if you take the Gmail app, obviously it's by Google, and Google has high stakes on Android, right? So it isn't necessarily the same comparison. Instead, what I wanted to do is, I generally do feel this, right? And I think I've talked to you about this. There are certain apps on the iPhone that are just like, they're amazing apps. Like the quality just like blows anything I've ever seen, on any other, on Android per se. And so that's basically what I said. I said, okay, how about we do this, right? Let's look at purely just the OS platforms and see like the capability of each platform, right? Like, if you give me the best app in category X, for a specific category, if you give me the best app for iOS and Android, let's compare those. Let's see what what developers can really do. And that's like the angle I was trying to like go at it. And I have like some examples of like some iOS apps, right? And that was my point. I was like, look at the quality of how these apps are built, and like, let's try to find something off the same category, right? Like, what is the best, RSS reader you can find on Android, and what is the best RSS reader you can find on iOS? Let's compare those, right? What's the best? And the one that's really easy is, let's look at, and we've talked about this in previous episodes too, right? Like, what's the best music making app that you can find, right? And GarageBand, like, and is like I don't know if it's not native on iOS. I think you have to download it, but it's built by Apple. Mm-hmm. It is a phenomenal app, and it's not just in like, user design and that kind of stuff, but what it allows you to do, the capabilities of like GarageBand is phenomenal, right? There is no music making app to my knowledge on Android that comes close to GarageBand.
No, not at all. It's not, you can't even compare. In fact, I'm going to take a step further and say, no multimedia applications can even touch multimedia applications on iPhones. Like iPhone multimedia application that goes for video editing, audio editing, music making, photos, etc. Any of those. And this is probably not going to be a very popular opinion for most people, but I feel the iOS versions completely blow them out of the water in regards to Android. And that's not a hit on developers. I think that's one thing I want to make clear. It's not a hit on developers. We have to understand the technology in which we're working with, and also the limits of the actual devices that we're working within. So that makes it very challenging.
It's a little subtle, right? It isn't, because then, like, again, people start to question, so is it not possible to build something like that on Android? It is. Like, the capability is present, and this is the crux of what I was trying to bring with the whole blog post, right? It is possible, but to get to that 80% is easy, right? Like, if you're looking for 80% quality, like, it's pretty easy to do that on both platforms, right? Yes. But the last 20% is where it gets really hard on like Android, at least in my opinion, right? If you want to build like the kind of quality of like something like GarageBand, for example, that last 20% is going to like take 80% of the time, like the whole, how the 80-20 rule goes.
Yeah, the Pareto principle.
Exactly. So that last 20% on Android is where it gets extremely difficult. But on iOS, like, it doesn't. And that was the angle that I was bringing at, right? Because it isn't about lazy Android developers at all, and even if I know like that's probably not what he meant eventually, the point is, if anything, and I've also like another part of my blog post where I was trying to explain my idea is, if anything, I think Android developers care a lot about software engineering practices. More so, I would go so far as to say they care way more about like good engineering practices than even iOS developers.
Yeah, I've been on tons of, countless teams where we have iOS developers on for the iOS platform, while I'm working on the Android platform, and by far, in my experience, the Android teams are always focused more on patterns, practices, design principles, software engineering, and the thing is it just, when I talk to the iOS folks at some teams, there were some companies that were very advanced. For example, like American Express, their iOS team, amazing. They do some great engineering, really care about patterns, practices, all that kind of stuff. Some other companies that I've worked for, they just didn't even worry about it, and the app just worked very well. And I think you kind of got into that a little bit inside of your blog post.
Yeah, so that was my point. Like, the thing is, for iOS developers, the reason that they didn't have to sweat the details as much is because they don't need to. That's the point, right?
Why don't they need to? I mean, what do you think the real reason that the iOS folks don't need to?
So there are a couple of reasons. I think, again, this may not be the most popular opinion, but I think Apple just was first in this race, right? Like, even if Android had an operating system before, like you said, right? In many ways, I think it was like retrofit into working for the phone, like in the very early days I'm talking about, right? But iOS was just built to work for the phone, for the iPhone, right? And so everything about iOS is let's make this specific device the best, right? And there's a couple of specific reasons that I bring about in that blog post too, right? And this, I think we've maybe talked about this too. We talk so much about dependency injection and Dagger, right? To this day, and it's almost like an ongoing thing. Even last week, there's another, for folks who are interested, there's this thing called Anvil by Square, which is another plugin that I'm really interested about. It's similar to Hilt from Dagger, from Google, that they released for Dagger. But just think about it, right? Google, the big company that it is, actually focused on writing an extension to an existing dependency injection framework, Dagger, that already exists. How crazy is that, right?
To make it easier. Just for that simple reason.
Right. And you know what iOS folks do, Don?
What do they do?
What library they use?
What?
They don't use one. You know why?
Do they do constructor injection?
Yeah. You can just call the constructor. You can have a view controller, their activity. Just think about this. How crazy is this? If you could create an activity and pass dependencies in the constructor. So
for people that are visiting us maybe for the first time, new listeners or whatever, if you may have seen where, as our artwork says, software podcast, if you're not familiar with Android, you can't, given kind of the root level entry points of your application, such as the application object, activities, fragments, etc. There's some caveats, but you cannot perform constructor injection. You just don't have that ability. So you're kind of having to do some weird mutator injection or field injection, which gets kind of a little hairy.
The reason they do this is because the system can terminate your application at any point of time, and you can't rely on the system to call your constructors and have your activity be reconstructed, right?
Yeah.
My response to that is, that's a good reason. But you know what would be even better? Not even having to worry about it. Why is the system even having to do that? And I know obviously it's easy for me to sit here as we have this gargantuan operating system that's served millions and millions of people, right? I get that, but these are the small things that land up becoming a big issue in the end.
Yeah, and I think you touched on it kind of briefly, is that when the iPhone was developed, it was developed for a phone. And we've touched again on this on the podcast numerous times, is Android was initially not developed for a phone. Android was actually a camera operating system that was an independent company outside of Google. 2005, Google acquired the Android corporation, and at that point in time started turning it into a phone operating system. And it wasn't, as soon as the iPhone came out, Google realized wow, we don't have any feet in this game whatsoever. And mobile is going to be a humongous platform, and we're completely locked out of it. And we need to get into that platform somehow. So they had Android, and they took what they had and turned it into a phone operating system. And so unfortunately, you're left with a lot of design decisions that were made previously. And to be honest, at some point, there's part of the operating system that was and is kind of like a house of cards. And we've just kind of, or not we've, but Google has reinforced the foundation so it's a little more stable. But we're working with something that wasn't built for what it's kind of being used for, and now we're kind of slapping more lipstick on this thing as we go along, and it makes it more challenging. And you mentioned this before as well, is that I think you did in your blog post that Android, and iPhone being different, there's different languages, there's different technologies. Android runs a JVM, it has a VM that runs. And this is kind of coming from my perspective, is that one of the reasons why a lot of iPhone apps are better is because as developers, they were required to write Objective-C for a long time. And if you've ever written Objective-C, you kind of have to start managing memory, and you have to kind of start worrying about some pointers. And I know there's idiosyncrasies, and I'm not going to get into the details, but you were really close to the metal. And that meant you had to kind of watch what you were doing inside of your application. And in the JVM, you don't really have to do that, because the garbage collector is going to take care of a lot of that, which then also introduces some other problems of, indeterminism and so forth like that could lock up your application. And what I'm trying to say is that on iPhone, you're really writing really close to the metal. I mean, you're writing like a C level language, and C is notoriously faster than Java. And a lot of those things, when you have to manage those things, and the times that I've written iPhone applications, you don't get this pretty little application not responding error. The app just strip crashes. It just disappears. Right. You're like, what happened there? And then you need to go digging for clues. And so there's different ways that the applications were made. And I think that iPhone, with its very, it's got some high quality hardware, and with the languages and technologies it's used, allows for especially a lot more multimedia applications and a lot more robust applications to be built with a lot less software engineering effort.
I mean, and you brought up a fantastic point, like the whole memory model, right? Like where you have like a mini JVM of sorts running, right? Which does garbage collection. In part, like, the smoothness of the UI in the early days was because, like, if you had like the garbage collector run in between, it would just like lock your UI up, right? Like, in that, like in those...
The jitter.
Yeah, the jitter. And like you said, in the early days for iOS, they had to like manage that memory on their own, which is crazy to think about it. Of course, these days they have this thing called ARC, which is auto reference counting or automatic reference counting or something, So they don't actually have to do that. But
exactly,
like you said, it's closer to the metal. Like every object is almost managed individually, which means you don't ever like run in, not that you don't ever, but it greatly minimizes the kind of situations that would arise where performance is an issue, your view doesn't render correctly, and that kind of stuff, right? And even the RX stuff, like RX Java, like Android developers were very early on, like jumping onto RX, right? But this whole thread management thing was something that was unique to Android. Like we had to care way more about switching threads or, schedulers or thread pools than the iOS folks do, right? It was crazy. And this was like maybe a year back or 2 years back when I was working with my iOS colleagues.
Yeah.
They didn't like their first pass of building a feature. They didn't even think about it. Database calls, all that is like happening in the main thread. And I'm like, whoa, hold on. Like, what are you talking about? Why would you do that? Right. And I remember my colleague's response. He's like, yeah, you're right. We should probably do that. And it might make it faster. As a general practice for performance, it might make it better. But in practice, it barely matters. Again, because of the way the iPhone was built, right? It was built originally, multitasking was something that was actually added much later on to iPhone, right? So it was written to be like a fully optimized, like single, like blazingly fast single threaded processor, right? So what it runs, it will run super fast, right? And because of that kind of a memory model, like in many ways, it made it easier for like developers to not have to care about this until much later,
Yeah. And I want to make this very, very clear, is that in my professional opinion here, I feel that Android developers have it way harder than iOS developers. And that's not discounting that iOS development is easy. No, all software is difficult. It's hard to be a programmer. But there's a few reasons for this, is because, and my opinion is, let's just take it kind of from a 30,000 foot view. How many iOS devices are there? There's a number of them. There's a number of form factors, but for the longest time, there was just a handful. And still, if you juxtapose it against Android, there is still just a handful of iOS devices. Sure, you have the iPhone 11 and 11 Max, and the S and the SE, I think it is, the smaller ones. But literally, there's just a handful of them. So you can get your application blazingly fast, run perfect, buttery smooth on that new Pixel device that you're running on Android. And then someone in another country installs it on some weird off-the-shelf device, and that thing just completely lags, blows up the memory, crashes the application. That's something that Android developers have to worry about. And so, do you make that application available to that device? Do you not? Do you limit your market size? These are all decisions that you have to make. Do you restrict the features because you know the lower-end models can't support it? iOS developers don't have to worry about that. They have a very small subset of devices they have to adhere to. They know that there's memory that's going to be available at this very minimum level. Android, we don't. We're like a web browser. And that's a weird comparison, but I have no idea if this thing's going to be run on a small little tablet. I have no idea if it's going to be run on a big tablet, on a phone, a bigger phone. Like, I don't even know. Like, I just have to let everything scale and hope it works out and do as much testing as I can. You don't have to worry about that as an iOS developer. And then when you get into the details, like you said, like, hey, we're going to run a database query on the main thread because it's just super fast and built for that, and it works. We have to worry about that. Right. And as Android developers have to worry about that. And so overall, I feel that Android developers definitely have it much more difficult, not discounting iOS developers. Xcode sucks, by the way.
Yeah. Oh, God. Yeah.
So Android Studio is way better than Xcode, but when we look at, the entire ecosystem, I definitely feel that iOS developers can have it like a walk in the park compared to a lot of Android developers.
There's like a couple of follow-up points from what you said, which makes perfect sense. The common retort is, well, have you used Xcode? It really sucks. Android Studio is better, so the tools are better.
Totally.
And yes, the tools are better. And you know what? Actually, Google does a phenomenal job reacting to developers. They listen to us, relative to like Apple and the iOS developers. To them, the fact that Apple would even care, let alone listen, is like crazy, right? So we have it way better on that front. But I think in large part, a lot of this is like reaction. That core foundation was not as strong as iOS. And so we're having to like account. And yes, we do a lot of things to, manage that problem. But eventually, if you had a stronger core, like a lot of these problems would have gone away. We wouldn't have to worry about a lot of these problems, right? And it is what it is. Yeah, Android, like the reason it became popular and like it has such a big market share is because of some of those compromises that were made. Hindsight is 2020, but
totally is. And you nail it. Hindsight's 2020. It is what it is. And I actually spoke to someone from Google who's been there for quite a while. They'll be renamed nameless for their safety, but I brought up these points to say, hey, look, Android is kind of like this pig with lipstick sometimes, and it sucks. And like testing is a freaking nightmare, and like I can't stand it. And sometimes I literally want to throw my phone through my computer because Gradle says I can't find the test suite, or Gradle fails, or something takes 35 minutes to build. And
oh God, yeah.
Like all the frustrations that we've all had. And, the person looked at me and said, well, you got to realize that at that point, back when when the iPhone came out, this is all that Google had. And we all had to execute immediately to be able to survive. We had to get a product out, and that product was Android. And it's not perfect, and it's never going to be perfect. And without us making the decisions that we did back then, none of us would be here in this developer ecosystem. He goes, so yeah, it sucks. Yeah, we know it sucks. We're trying to fix it, but it just kind of is what it is. And we just got to kind of move forward.
That makes perfect sense. Like, especially to what you were saying, there were compromises that were made. I remember when I posted my tweet about this blog post, Ben Dotson, I think he's an Android developer at Snapchat. He responded too, right? Like he said, like, you're also underestimating the impact of an ailing Android view hierarchy, right? Like that's the view class has like around like 30,000 lines of code. That's got to have like an impact in some ways to like performance, right? Like you cannot avoid that. And view is like the most basic thing that we use on Android, right? Like
everything's inherited from it. Yeah.
Yeah. So there's a lot of like that baggage that has been accumulated that, requires like cleaning up, it's not easy. And like, who knows, maybe you can never. And Jetpack Compose is like the opportunity to be able to like move away from a lot of that. Again, I think it is based on views, but there was a conversation again that was going on about that. But like there's a lot of baggage that comes with having like this ailing sort of system.
Things are so old, and eventually businesses have to make the decision, like, are they going to support, and you've seen this happen, I'm sure you've done with it, like, hey, we're only going to support up to this API level, because the refresh rate of the operating system only moves at a certain rate. And thankfully, most libraries now are being pulled out into, or most core components are being pulled out into libraries. But even the new operating system upgrades are not going to be available to most people for a couple of years until they upgrade their phones. So it's kind of a nice, well, not a nice, but a challenging aspect of app development with businesses of like, all right, at what level are we going to stop supporting an old version because it's just slowing us down too much because of X, Y, and Z.
Right. And again, with Android, I know they have to support like a whole bunch of like previous versions, right? Like Android as in Google does, because there's still like a lot of parts of the world where they use super old versions of Android that you frankly cannot avoid. I remember, I think it was maybe Facebook or someone who said that they have a very similar problem, and the challenges are like crazy when you talk about having to support like Android 8 or 9. That just sends like shivers down my spine just thinking about it.
Yeah, and it goes back to the whole device situation, and a lot of those devices in a lot of smaller remote areas of the world that don't have great connectivity, running on limited hardware, like. And you've seen this with, I think, like Facebook. There's like a Facebook Lite app, and which happened way back in the day with the Android market. There was always like the Lite version, and I went away, and now it's kind of come back because folks need to be able to, to download an app that's not heavyweight, or they may need Messenger-like because they don't need all the features, but they do need to communicate.
One last point I wanted to bring up with this whole thing is, again, comparing it to like the work for iOS developers, right? For us, like, and this, I talked about this in the blog post, and this is like first-hand experience, right? I remember when I was at Wedding Party, we had like a camera like app, and we had to like support a lot of that stuff. I would spend sleepless nights basically getting I would build the whole functionality. It would work amazingly well on a Pixel. I would be happy, but that again, we would, if I have to support more than just one device, I would spend like sleepless nights trying to get it to work just right on like just work, forget like polishing, just to get the functionality to work because of some weird platform like specific bugs. In the meantime, my iOS colleagues would like casually just like maybe finish like their first iteration after like me, but what, for them they were pretty much done at that point, and all the leftover time they could spend on like really polishing like the details and like the small nuances, right? Which lands up producing a much better and higher quality app, And is that like the fault of the lazy developer? No, It's just that you need way more time to get to that last 20%, right?
You do. It's the last 20%. And, the last thing for me to say is that a lot of iOS folks are like, well, why is it so difficult in Android? Mm-hmm. Let's also remember that Android is the most popular operating system in the world.
Right.
It's installed in the most places throughout the world. It's going to allow people to get connected throughout the world. So it's going to take, especially given how it's built, it's going to take more effort. And it just kind of is what it is at this point. And we just kind of have to accept it if you're going to be developing for Android, that that's just how it is. And there's just a lot of trade-offs that you have to make throughout the day and figure out what's best for your business and your market.
And I know you would appreciate this angle, but there's also the fact that just iOS users are more willing to spend money, right?
Oh, totally.
And that's a common stat that's cited where they're like, well, Android has the bigger market share, so shouldn't companies/developers focus on Android? Yes, but that's not how the world works. Like in the end, you need to make money, and the people who are more willing to pay money are the ones that are going to potentially get more resources and time, right? So if I'm an indie developer and I have to build, the choice is between building an iOS app or an Android app, I'm going to pick the one that gives me more money, and that's no fault of my own. That's smart. That's what you should be doing.
Yeah, if you want to make a business out of it, you have to look at, a business is something that makes money. It's profit. Otherwise it's a hobby. And I think that's a lot of people don't like hearing that, especially if they have side project. Well, I want to make this free. That's fine. You can make it free. But if you have zero intentions on making money off of it, It's a hobby.
Yeah.
And if you want to make money off it, then you do have to perform some type of market analysis and figure out where you're going to get the best bang for the buck. Is it iOS? Maybe. Is it Android? Maybe. Depends on your use case.
But I will say this, like I know like we've gone like this really dark turn on Android, but
that's just being real though. I mean, it's not.
It is, yeah. That is fair. But in the end, there's a huge opportunity here. That's the beauty of this, right? You know what? As Android, and a lot of Android developers who listen to our podcast are like, some of the best in the world, right? Like top-notch folks. So there's an opportunity. Like, we should prove people wrong. Like, let's sweat the details. Let's come out with these apps. Obviously, if we don't, there's no fault. But I gave some examples, right? Like there's like a to-do list app that I love on the iPhone called Things. There's and forget that, like there's an RSS reader app called Reader, Reeder. I mean, if folks have an iPhone, I highly encourage you to like try this. I mean, it's a freaking RSS reader, but the level of details and polish that goes into this is mind freaking blowing, and in some ways I feel inspired, right? Like my Pixel 4a is supposed to be coming end of this month. I want to like sweat the details. I want to build like an app, even if it's a small app. Like, what does it take to like really build that kind of polish to make it like a phenomenal kind of Android app? There's opportunity there, right? And if you're one of those Android developers who can pull it off, trust me, a lot of companies are looking for people like that. And, it's as Android developers, this is a huge opportunity, right? If you can be someone who champions high quality products and is like an Android developer who can pull it off, you stand to like make a lot of money,
You do. Folks ask all the time, how do I, get into consulting? How do I do what you're doing, Donn? And that's just being out there. And I said, well, you have to just do your best work. And focus and push stuff out there and share what you know.
It's funny. That's like your story, basically, right?
Yeah. And just share what you know.
You became that person who's able to like pull off like high quality Android apps. If it was MyFitnessPal, a lot of like the early stuff that you worked on, grew on.
Yeah. And that's just, but that's the thing is like, just do your best work and just ship high quality stuff, and people will start hearing about it. People will learn about it, talk about it. And eventually, there is, like you said, there's a lot of opportunity out there. And that's literally how I got started, because there was not a lot of folks out there that would ship high quality stuff. Everything would crash, nothing would work. And I'd come in to a lot of companies, to a lot of even small companies that would have, 1 or 2 employees, and I'd help fix their Android application. Like, oh, here's here's what's going to give us the best bang for the buck. Here's your budget. Cool. I'm going to fix all these glaring issues and then at least make it stable, so then they could start, iterating and improving. And you do stuff like that, just identify problems and solve them correctly and make the applications work. You have a big future.
Yeah, well said.
I think we kind of really hashed out that blog post of yours, and I hope that clarifies a lot of details for a lot of people, because I know there was quite a discussion on your tweet that you had about it.
Yeah, and I'm glad I got a chance to talk to you in depth as well, because sometimes there's only so much you can talk about like in a blog post, right? It's the advantage of having a podcast. You can like really flush your feelings out.
Go deep on it. So
perfect. Anything else you wanted to add on that, Donn?
Nope, but I think that wraps it up pretty much. I think we covered it.
Alrighty, and I'll catch you later, Donn.
See you later.
That's it for the show, folks. Fragmented is hosted by Donn Felker and me, Kaushik Gopal. We edit and produce all the episodes here on Fragmented. You can find more Fragmented episodes at fragmentedpodcast.com. Thanks for listening, and we will catch you in the next episode.